She had 6 weeks. Not 6 weeks until help arrived. Not 6 weeks until the weather turned. 6 weeks until the ground in Spink County, Dakota Territory, froze solid from the surface down, and in a year with almost no snow cover, that frost would push 4 feet, maybe 5, maybe deeper, and anything she had not yet planted, buried, or built by then was going to die. Her name was Nora Seidel. She was 29 years old, born Nora Haugen, in a sod house in Marshall County, Minnesota, the second daughter of a Norwegian farmer who died of a burst appendix when she was 11. She had been on the Dakota frontier for 4 years. Her husband had been in the ground for 11 days. And the 80 acres she now stood on the clay-heavy, low-lying Slough Quarter in the southwest corner of Section 14 was, by any fair measure, the worst farm in the county. The people who gave it to her had known that when they chose it. The 3rd of October, 1887, Wilhelm Seidel died of typhoid fever in the claim shanty he had built himself in the spring of 1884, on the quarter section he and Nora had broken and planted, and slowly, season by season, turned into something that looked almost like a real farm. He was 34 years old. They had been married 6 years. They had no children. He left behind a tin box under the floorboards containing $22.40, a team of horses named Burke and Grau, 1 milk cow, 2 spotted pigs, an iron stove that needed a new collar, and 43 acres of broken ground with a wheat crop still standing in the field because he had died before he could bring it in. Typhoid on the frontier does not give you much time to prepare. You wake one morning with a headache that sits behind your eyes and a low-grade heat in your blood that you mistake for exertion. 4 days later, the heat has become a fire, and the fire is eating through everything the body uses to keep itself together. Wilhelm was sick 9 days total. Nora slept in a chair beside him for 8 of those nights, boiling water on the stove, changing compresses, keeping the shanty warm. She sent the neighbour's boy, 12-year-old Otto Kessler, who lived 3/4 of a mile north, to ride for the doctor in Redfield. The doctor was 31 miles away. He arrived on the 7th day, looked at Wilhelm for 10 minutes, and told Nora in a flat voice that there was nothing he could do except keep the patient cool and keep him drinking. On the morning of the 9th day, Wilhelm Seidel stopped breathing. Nora sat in the chair beside him for a long time before she did anything else. Not because she was paralyzed, though the size of it sat on her like a stone, but because she understood, with the particular clarity that sometimes arrives in the first minutes of a catastrophe, that everything happening next was going to depend on decisions made in the next 6 weeks. Winter was coming. She had $22.40. She had no family within 400 miles. And somewhere outside in the thin October light, the men who would decide what she kept and what she lost were already running numbers. Wilhelm's 2 brothers, Ernst and Carl Seidel, had come to Dakota Territory 2 years after Wilhelm and Nora. They had claimed adjacent quarters, Ernst on the section directly north, Carl a mile east, and unlike Wilhelm, who had filed under the Homestead Act and put in 5 years of residency to earn his title, Ernst had used the Preemption Act and had the means to commute his claim at $1.25 an acre after only 6 months. Ernst Seidel had money when he arrived. His farm showed it. A proper barn, a house with a second room framed in, 40 bushels of coal in a bin, a well drilled to 80 feet. He was 38 years old and ran his operation the way a man runs an operation when failure is an inconvenience rather than a death sentence. They came to the funeral, both of them. Ernst read from Corinthians. Carl helped lower the box. They shook Nora's hand at the grave, and their condolences were not insincere. Grief is real, even in men who are already calculating. She could see them looking at the barn. She could see them looking at the wheat in the field. Under Dakota Territory law in 1887, a widow whose husband died without a will which Wilhelm had not written, because he was 34 and had not expected to need one, held what was called her dower right, a life interest in 1/3 of her husband's real property. The remaining 2/3 passed to the blood heirs. Wilhelm had no children. His blood heirs were Ernst and Karl. 1/3 of a 160-acre wheat farm, held for life only, was not a farm. It was a legal position that could be managed, pressured, contested, and eventually resolved in the heir's favour by a patient lawyer with adequate time. Ernst arrived at Nora's door on the morning of October 7th. He brought a man named Duer from Mellet, a notary public, and a document already drawn up and witnessed. The document transferred Wilhelm's full 160-acre homestead, the Good Quarter, with the creek access and the 43 broken acres and the real barn to Ernst and Nora Seidel in exchange for clear title to the Slough Quarter. 80 acres of low-lying clay ground that the Seidel brothers had filed on originally in 1882, surveyed, farmed for one season, and then quietly abandoned when they found the drainage inadequate and the soil too heavy for grain. Nora read the document twice. She read the legal language and read it again to make sure she had understood it correctly. Then she looked at Ernst, who was examining the seam where the wall met the roof, and asked him what would happen if she did not sign. Ernst explained, without looking at her, that her dower right to 1/3 of Wilhelm's property was entirely valid under Dakota law, and that he had no doubt she was entitled to it, and that the process of establishing and adjudicating that right before the county probate judge would likely take 8 to 12 months, during which time the property would sit in legal suspension, and that his attorney in Huron, a man named Feldkirch, would need to be involved throughout, and that such matters could become expensive and uncertain for all parties. He paused. He said he was sure they could find a resolution that honoured Wilhelm's memory. What he did not say, but what was present in the room as clearly as anything spoken. A widow's dower, right gave her life use of 1/3. 1/3 of 160 acres was 53 acres. Of those 53 acres, 2/3 were still unbroken sod requiring a horse team to break. Her dower claim was not a farm. It was a legal fraction of a farm, held for life only, meaning it would revert to Ernst and Karl at her death, meaning no bank would extend credit against it, meaning the $22 in the tin box was what she had between herself and the winter, and no legal document was going to change that in time to matter. The $22 would not last past November. The legal process Ernst was describing would take most of a year, cost money she did not have, and might produce nothing recoverable at the end of it. She signed. She signed on the kitchen table of the shanty Wilhelm had built with lumber freighted from Yankton in 1884, in the same room where he had died 9 days earlier, watched by a notary named Duer, who kept his eyes on the document, and by Ernst's careful blankness, and by Duer's leather case, and by the prairie light coming through the single west window at mid-morning, and she understood that she was signing away 4 years of her life, 4 years of planting and harvesting and surviving and building towards something as clearly as she had ever understood anything. What the document gave her? 80 acres of the Slough Quarter, the claim shanty itself, the milk cow, one of the pigs, the iron stove, the hand tools, and the $22.40 in the tin box. What it did not give her: the well, which was on Wilhelm's quarter, the barn and its contents, including the seed stored for spring, the horses, the wheat still standing in the field, which Ernst had not mentioned, and which his hired man cut and hauled away the following week while Nora stood at the section line and watched. The Slough Quarter had one quality: nobody who dismissed it had bothered to examine carefully, because nobody who dismissed it had needed to look at it the way Nora looked at it in the first week of October, 1887. The land sat low, yes. The clay was heavy, wet and resistant to any plough that could be pulled by a single animal, the kind of clay that swells when wet, locks when dry, and splits a single bottom ploughshare in one long afternoon. The drainage was poor. The water table was high, 11 feet, compared to the 30 or 40 that other quarters in the section required. The sedge grass and wolf willow in the lowest portions could not be broken without equipment nobody in the county owned. But 20 acres along the south edge of the property sat on a slight rise 2 feet, maybe 2.5 feet above the slough floor, where the ground drained adequately and the clay held enough organic matter from centuries of sedge decomposition to be workable. That rise faced due south. It was shielded on the north by the slough edge, which broke the worst of the wind. It caught sun from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon in October. Nobody growing grain had ever cared about any of this, because grain farming is about flat, broken acres and soil drainage. But Nora had spent 2 years reading Peter Henderson's Times, gardening for profit times in the evenings after she and Wilhelm finished the day's work, and what Henderson talked about obsessively, chapter after chapter, was light, angles, soil temperature, and the specific relationship between glass, sunlight, and earth that could produce warmth where warmth had no business existing. Henderson was a market gardener from New Jersey who had built one of the most successful fresh vegetable operations in 19th century America by understanding one principle better than almost anyone else of his time. Plants do not care what the temperature is outside the glass. They care about the temperature inside the glass, at the root zone, where their roots are actually living. Get that temperature right, and you can grow spinach in January in New Jersey. She sat at the kitchen table with Henderson's book and a pencil stub and a piece of brown paper saved from a grocery order, and she started drawing. Henderson called it a forcing pit. He described it precisely. A frame dug 18 to 24 inches into the ground, with a back wall higher than the front, so the structure angled toward the winter sun. Old window sashes laid across the top, any glass at all. Repurposed window frames, storm windows, anything transparent, let sunlight in and kept cold out. 18 inches of fresh horse manure, packed under the growing soil-generated heat for weeks through microbial decomposition, the same biological process that makes a compost pile warm to the touch in December. Henderson's pits in New Jersey held 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit inside when it was 30 degrees outside. He grew lettuce, radishes, and spinach from January straight through to April. Dakota was not New Jersey. The winters ran longer, and the cold arrived harder. The January sun angle, 23 degrees above the horizon at 44 degrees north latitude, where Spink County sat, was shallower than anything Henderson was designing for. His sash angles assumed a more southerly position. She would need to steepen them. But she also had something Henderson did not write about, or at least not in the way she was thinking about it now: the clay. Dakota slough clay, heavy and wet and dense, stores heat at nearly twice the rate of sandy loam. Clay absorbs heat slowly during the day and releases it slowly through the night, the way a fired brick holds warmth long after the fire dies. Henderson was building his pits for quick heating and fast-growing in temperate New Jersey. Nora was building hers to survive January and February in Dakota, and the clay, the same material that had made Ernst dismiss the Slough Quarter as worthless for grain, was going to be central to how she did it. She had one more resource nobody was accounting for. Ernst had taken the horses, but he had not cleaned out the barn floor. 3 years of horse manure, deep, packed, still chemically active, was sitting in the barn on the good quarter, free for anyone who wanted to haul it away. She drove stakes on the south slope on the morning of October 10th, marking 3 pit locations where the ground sat firmest and the south exposure was clearest. Then she went back to the shanty and calculated the back wall height she needed. The math was simple geometry. She wanted the glass surface to be roughly perpendicular to the noon sun in December. December noon sun at 44 north sits at 20 degrees above the horizon. A glass surface perpendicular to a 20-degree sun needs to tilt at 70 degrees from horizontal, but a fully vertical surface traps heat poorly because warm air escapes out the back wall gaps at night. She split the difference, 60 degrees from horizontal, which put the glass nearly perpendicular to the December noon sun while still angling gently enough to let condensation run down and off. She confirmed the angle the old-fashioned way. She drove a nail through a scrap of tin, tied a plumb bob of string to the nail, and, in the next clear midday, held the tin level and watched where the noon shadow fell against the south slope. She adjusted her back wall height until the shadow from the back wall's top edge just touched the front edge of the pit floor at noon. That was 60 degrees. The first day of digging, she took 6 inches out of the first pit location before the spade hit a layer of dense, nearly indurated clay that she had to chip through with the broadaxe before the spade would cut again. The slough clay at depth was the grey-blue colour of old iron and smelled faintly of sulphur from the organic decomposition below the water table. It came out in slabs that rang when they hit each other. She stacked them carefully to the north side of the excavation because she was already thinking about a secondary windbreak, and those slabs would be part of it. By the afternoon of day 2, she had the first pit roughed in to 14 inches. The back wall height she needed was 26 inches above the finished floor, which meant she was building up with sod brick above grade on the north side, while digging down on the south side, creating the angle with a combination of excavation and construction. Henderson described this method part below grade, part above, as the most efficient way to get the glass angle right without needing a deep excavation on the high side of a slope. He was right. The clay below grade held the walls without framing. The sod brick above grade needed no mortar because the weight of the courses above locked the ones below. On the 5th day, while she was cutting sod brick along the slough edge in the morning, Otto Kessler rode past on the section road. He was 12 years old and had a face that reminded Nora of a winter squash, broad, honest, slightly puzzled by everything. He reined in his horse and watched her cutting sod for a while. "What are you building?" he said. "Forcing pits," she said, "for winter vegetables." He looked at the south slope, where the first pit was roughed in, and the clay slabs were stacked in a rough wall to the north. "My mother does that," he said, "in a small way, with old boards and a window." "Henderson's book?" Nora asked. "She got it from the church ladies," Otto said. "She grows lettuce in December." He paused. "Not much of it. Tell her to come and see what I'm building before the frost," Nora said. "I'll show her what makes the difference." Otto's mother, Hannah Kessler, came out the following Thursday afternoon. She was a compact, practical German-Russian woman who had homesteaded with her husband since 1883 and who looked at the pits the way a person looks at something that solves a problem they had been thinking about for years without quite getting. There. She walked the length of all 3 pits. She looked at the back wall heights, the sod construction, the angle Nora had worked out. She asked 3 specific questions about the manure depth and the glass angle and the drainage below the growing medium. "The angle?" Hannah said. "How did you work that out?" Nora showed her the tin protractor with the plumb bob. Hannah held it in her palm for a moment. She handed it back. "You'll have customers this winter," she said. She was the first one to say it plainly. Nora had been thinking it since October, but there is a difference between thinking a thing and hearing it said out loud by a practical woman who has been farming the Dakota Prairie for 4 years and who is standing in front of evidence that makes it undeniable. What followed over the next 5 weeks would have looked, to anyone passing on the section road, like a woman methodically working herself to pieces. She hauled horse manure from Ernst's barn floor across the section line, collecting waste from the road easement, which was not trespass in a wheelbarrow she built herself by nailing boards around a salvaged iron wheel. 8 tons of manure total. 4 trips per day, each trip a 1/4 mile each way with a loaded barrow in October cold, She did this for 9 days. Her hands blistered on the handles, and the blisters opened, and she wrapped the raw skin in strips of flour sack and kept going because the frost was coming, and the frost was not going to wait for her palms to heal. She cut sod brick from the slough edge with her spade in the mornings when the clay was still firm enough to cut clean. Each brick ran 14 inches long and 4 inches thick and weighed 30 to 35 pounds. She cut 411 of them over 8 days. She stacked them 2 courses high on the north, east, and west walls of each pit, leaving the south face open for the glass. 2 courses of 4-inch sod, brick 16 inches of sod, gave her roughly R24 on the walls, better than the insulation in the claim shanty itself. She dug each pit to 20 inches. The clay came out in grey-blue slabs that she piled to the north side of each structure to serve as a secondary windbreak. She packed the manure 18 inches deep in each pit, tamping it layer by layer with the back of the spade to push out the air pockets. Air pockets would create cold pathways down through the mass. She needed solid contact between layers, so the heat generated in the lower section could transfer upward through the full depth without bleeding sideways into nothing. There was a smell to it that she got used to by day 3 of the hauling and did not notice much after that. The smell of fresh horse manure working is ammonia and warmth, and something faintly sweet underneath. And by the time she was packing the 3rd pit, she thought of it less as smell and more as evidence that what she was doing was working. She mixed the growing medium on top, 6 inches of clay, straw ash from 3 months of the stove, and the dark organic material skimmed from the slough edge where centuries of sedge roots had built something close to real loam. She worked it by hand in the borrowed wash basin, adding the ash in small amounts, testing the texture. Good growing medium holds its shape when you squeeze it, and crumbles when you let go. Clay alone holds its shape and does not crumble. She added enough ash and organic material until the mix broke apart correctly between her fingers. The window sashes were a separate problem. Glass was expensive. A standard 4-pane sash from Grothaus cost 80 cents in Millet, and she needed 12 of them to cover all 3 pits. $9.60 more than half of what remained after she bought flour, salt, and lamp oil. She spent every cent of it, plus $14 of credit from Reinhard Grothaus in Millet, who extended her credit on the sashes because he expected to foreclose on the Slav quarter before spring. His reasoning was practical. A widow with no horses on 80 acres of clay ground in a Dakota winter was a predictable transaction. The credit would come back to him in the form of the property deed. She walked the sashes home herself, 12 miles, in 2 trips on the handcart she had borrowed from the Kessler farm. 6 sashes per load, wrapped in the last piece of canvas she owned to keep the glass from rattling. The road was iron hard by mid-October, and the handcart made a sound like a railroad car on the frozen ruts. She glazed each sash herself, using the glazier's putty, working it with her thumb and the heel of her palm, the way she had watched it done once through a window in Millet. 2 of the sashes cracked during installation where a sod brick was not quite level beneath the frame edge. She patched both with pine tar she had been storing since September in a tin can on the shanty shelf. She set the sashes at 60 degrees on the back wall heights she had calculated. She planted October 25th into growing medium that was already warm to the touch from the manure 6 inches below the roots, spinach seedlings she had started inside the shanty in early October, winter radish seed, kale seed from Oscar H. Will's fall catalogue, 3 varieties of cabbage. On October 28th, the first killing frost struck Spink County. Temperature at sunrise, 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Every garden still above ground in the county turned black by morning. The Kessler kitchen garden, the Paulson tomatoes, whatever Ernst Seidel had left in his field garden, all of it blackened and collapsed before noon. On the morning of October 29th, Nora opened the glass sash of the first pit and looked in. The spinach was fine, 6 inches tall, dark green, the leaves full and firm. The horse manure 18 inches beneath the roots had generated enough biological heat through the night. The internal temperature of active horse manure in aerobic decomposition runs between 60 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit, to keep the soil at the root zone several degrees above freezing. The glass above had trapped enough residual warmth from the previous afternoon's sun that the air inside had not dropped to the killing threshold. She closed the sash. She went back to the shanty and made the last of the good coffee she had been saving. Outside, the dead black garden of November spread from the shanty to the horizon in every direction. Inside 3 pits on the south slope of the worst farm in Spink County, green plants were growing. Reinhard Grothaus came out the 3rd week of November to discuss the credit note. He drove his buggy in on a Tuesday, tied the horse to the hitching post, and walked with her to the south slope. He was 51 years old, broadly built, slow-spoken, with the particular authority of a man who controls credit in a community with no other source of it. He stood in front of the 3 pits for a long time. The spinach was 6 inches tall by then. The cabbage seedlings were at 3 inches. The Siberian kale was beginning to put out its second true leaves. You could feel warmth rising if you held your palm 2 inches above the glass in the midday sun. "Those pits are going to freeze," he said. "First sustained cold snap first week with no sun, the glass isn't enough. That manure slows down by January." What then? He was not wrong about the manure. Microbial decomposition in horse manure generates heat in inverse proportion to how far the decomposition has progressed. In a freshly packed pit, the internal temperature can exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Over 8 to 12 weeks, the output drops substantially as the available carbon to nitrogen ratio shifts and the peak biological activity fades. By late January, her pits would be running primarily on residual soil heat and whatever the sun put in each day. She had already been thinking about this. She had 30 feet of 4-inch stovepipe on the credit order. It was going to run in a channel 18 inches below the pit floor surface from a small outdoor firebox built on the sheltered north side of each pit, through the growing medium and out the far end. 2 hours of burning scrap wood in the firebox at morning and 2 hours at evening would carry warm air under the root zone the way a Roman hypocaust carried heat under a floor. The same principle, the same physics, built from salvaged iron pipe instead of ceramic tile. 2 hours of burning would hold the soil temperature above freezing for 22 hours. She explained this to Grothaus. He listened. He also looked at the other structure she had been digging, which ran 8 feet long and 2 feet wide along the sheltered north side of the rise, roofed with boards from the old shanty flooring, covered with 2 feet of packed straw and a course of sod on top. Her food storage channel, dug not 2.5 feet like every standard root cellar in the county dug 4 feet down. Grothaus looked at the depth marker she had left, sticking up from the cover. 4 feet. "That's a great deal of digging in clay," he said. "Yes," she said. "At 4 feet, the temperature is going to be around 32 to 36 degrees, he said, "even in a hard winter." "Yes," she said. He looked at her. He was the kind of man who ran a lot of calculations simultaneously, and whose calculations were generally right. And he understood in that moment that the arithmetic on the Slough quarter had shifted in a way he had not fully accounted for in October. He extended the note to February 1st. He drove back to Millet. Now the physics deserves its full accounting, because Grothaus understood the theory and missed the mechanism, and the mechanism is the only part that matters. Here is what happens when January sunlight passes through a glass pane and strikes dark soil. Sunlight arrives as electromagnetic radiation in short wavelengths, the visible spectrum. The near-infrared. Glass is largely transparent to these wavelengths. The light passes through, strikes the dark clay soil and the dark straw mulch and whatever dark material lines the pit, and is absorbed. When it is absorbed, it is converted to heat, which is long-wave infrared radiation. And here is the asymmetry that makes everything work. Glass is largely opaque to long-wave infrared. The energy goes in as short-wave radiation and cannot get back out as long-wave radiation. It is trapped. This is the greenhouse effect operating at its most basic scale, requiring no technology more sophisticated than a window pane. On a clear January day at 44 degrees north latitude, south-facing glass tilted at the correct angle collects between 75,000 and 90,000 BTU of solar energy per day through a standard 8 by 12 foot sash area. That number is not trivial. A good wood stove burning dry hardwood at 10 pounds per hour produces roughly 500,000 BTU per hour, but almost none of that energy reaches plant roots. It heats air, which rises to the ceiling and leaks out through every gap in the shanty walls. The solar pit directed its energy into the soil itself, into the clay that Nora had mixed with manure and ash, into the dense thermal mass that absorbed it during the day and released it slowly through the night. Clay soil has a volumetric heat capacity of roughly 40 BTU per cubic foot per degree Fahrenheit, nearly double that of sandy loam. In a pit 8 feet wide by 12 feet long by 20 inches deep, she had approximately 160 cubic feet of growing medium. On a clear Dakota January day, the solar gain through 3 sashes raised the temperature of that material by 30 to 40 degrees from morning to afternoon peak, and the clay released it through the night, the way a fired brick fireplace holds warmth long after the last log has burned down to ash. When it was 15 degrees outside, it was 50 degrees inside the pits at noon. When it was 0 outside, it was 35 to 40 degrees inside, cold enough that the manure's supplemental heat was still needed, but well above the killing threshold for the plants. When the outside temperature dropped to -20, which happened twice before Christmas, the pits fell to 18 or 20 degrees inside. The spinach went flat and pale and pressed itself against the soil. Then the sun rose the next morning, hit the glass, and within 2 hours the pit was back above freezing. Within 4 hours the spinach had lifted and recovered, standing upright and dark green, as though nothing had happened. Kale will survive a temperature of 12 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit and emerge the following morning showing no visible damage. This is not a recent agricultural discovery, it is a characteristic that Atlantic coastline winters and Baltic sea winds selected into the ancestors of that plant over thousands of years of hard frost, and Oscar H., Will's Siberian variety, bred partly from seed he obtained from a Hidatsa gardener at Fort Berthold, where growing food through extreme cold was not a new practice, was more cold-tolerant than anything available from Eastern seed catalogues. But the deeper problem was never the air temperature inside the pits. The deeper problem was what was happening under the ground across the rest of the county, a problem that the black frost year of 1887-88 was about to make catastrophically visible. Spink County, in the autumn of 1887, received almost no snow. The summer had been drier than average across the northern plains. The fall storms that normally delivered 2 or 3 early inches in October came as dry wind instead, cold and clear, and by November the county had less than an inch of accumulation total. The prairie wind scattered even that off the top of the dead grass before it could pack. By December, the topsoil was bare and iron-hard, and the thermometer outside Grothouse's grain store reached -12 on December 15th, -18 on December 22nd, -24 on December 31st. Snow insulates the earth. Fresh snow is 80 to 90% air trapped between ice crystals, and that trapped air is one of the best natural insulators that exists. 12 inches of fresh, undisturbed snow insulates the soil beneath it at approximately R12 to R18, equivalent to the insulation in a well-built house wall. Under 12 inches of snow cover at -40 above, The soil at 4 feet down stays within a few degrees of freezing. The protective effect is so powerful that modern soil scientists at South Dakota State University, measuring paired plots in a snowless winter, documented frost penetrating 3 times deeper in bare ground conditions than in snow-covered conditions. In the worst bare ground winters on the northern plains, Mesonet instruments have recorded frost reaching 57 to 69 inches below the surface, nearly 6 feet, and in at least one documented case, breaking a municipal water main buried at 8 feet. The standard root cellar in Spink County in 1887 was dug to 2.5 feet. Some were 3 feet. Grothouse's own cellar, which was better built than most, reached 4 feet. These depths had been adequate for 3 consecutive winters with normal snowfall. In a snowless winter at sustained -20 to -30, the math was different by an order of magnitude. The frost came down like a blade through bare clay, reaching 2.5 feet in 3 weeks, reaching 4 feet in 5 weeks, reaching deeper every night. The thermometer dropped and the sky stayed clear and the prairie stayed bare. Every root cellar in the county dug to the standard depth began showing damage in early December. Grothouse's own cellar, 4 feet, boarded, mounded with dirt, reached 28 degrees Fahrenheit on January 3rd, 1888. His potatoes were showing frost damage. The 60-quart jars his wife had put up in August were in danger. Nora Seidel's cellar was 2 feet deep. He had not deepened it. 3 mild winters with adequate snowfall had taught him exactly the wrong lesson about what the 4th winter would do. On January 4th, Ernst's cellar temperature was 24 degrees Fahrenheit. The potatoes were frozen through. The temperature in Nora's storage channel on January 4th, at 4 feet depth, under 2 feet of packed straw and a course of sod, 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Her 140 pounds of potatoes were fine. Her turnips were fine. Her 41 jars of preserves sat in the cool dark exactly as she had placed them in November. This was the difference between R2 per inch of loose straw, R48 for 2 feet of cover, and a standard wooden cellar door with a mound of bare clay on top. January 6th, 1888. The Signal Corps station at Fort Buford, Dakota Territory, recorded -28 degrees Fahrenheit. Bismarck logged -24. Stations across central Minnesota measured between -21 and -30. No snow, no wind. The sky was absolutely clear, and the stars at night looked close enough to cut yourself on, which is what the sky looks like when the atmosphere has been wrung completely dry of water vapor. The thermometer outside Grothouse's grain store in Mellette reached -31 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of January 8th. The high that day was -14. This was a black frost. The American Meteorological Society defines it precisely: a dry freeze unaccompanied by the protective formation of hoarfrost. No white rime on the surfaces, no snow. The air is bone dry and absolutely still. You go to bed under clear stars, and in the morning everything above ground that was still green is black. The internal cellular water has frozen, the tissue has collapsed, and the plant is dead in the particular silent way that dry cold kills, leaving no visible trace of what happened except the color. In those 6 days, the frost line in bare Spink County ground pushed from its December depth to an estimated 50 to 54 inches below the surface, based on penetration rates measured in modern bare ground conditions at comparable temperatures. More than 4 feet of frozen soil, deeper in the lighter sandy ground to the east. Every root cellar in the county at standard depth was frozen solid or close to it. In Mellette, stovepipes glowed red by early afternoon as families burned through their day's wood allotment by noon. Coal was moving off Grothouse's shelves faster than freight could bring it from the Northern Pacific railhead. Livestock died in barns that had gone 3 mild winters without reinforcement. Nora Seidel lost 4 cattle on the night of January 8th. froze in the barn because the chinking was inadequate and the cold found every gap. Carl Seidel lost his entire 200-pound potato store to hard freeze. The Kessler family, 3/4 of a mile north of Nora's claim, had been eating dried beans and salt pork since their cellar froze in December. Mrs. Brunner in Mellette was melting snow off the roof to water her children because the town well pump had frozen solid at the head. Reinhard Grothaus sat in his office above the grain store on January 9th and looked at his damaged potato cellar and thought about the woman on the Slough Quarter whose note was due February 1st. On the morning of January 7th, 1888, the outside temperature at the Slough Quarter was -27 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 feet below the surface of Nora's storage channel, 33 degrees. The potatoes were fine. Every other root cellar she knew of within 12 miles was frozen. Hers was not. Inside the forcing pits at 8 in the morning, before the sun cleared the horizon, 18 degrees. Cold enough that the spinach lay flat and still against the soil, the kale slightly frost-touched on its outermost leaves. The horse manure beneath the growing medium 6 weeks past its peak generation period was still contributing roughly 1,200 BTU per day per cubic yard. Not enough alone, but enough combined with what was about to happen when the sun moved. At 9:40 in the morning, January light cleared the horizon and hit the glass. The temperature inside the first pit rose from 18 degrees to 24 in 20 minutes. In 40 minutes, it was 28. By 11 o'clock, it was 36 degrees, and the spinach was beginning to lift off the soil. By noon, with the sun at its low-angle peak, the air inside each pit held at 38 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. A 65-degree differential generated by old window glass tilted at 60 degrees toward the winter sun, sitting on a rise of clay soil that Ernst and Carl Seidel had walked away from in 1882 because it would not grow wheat. Nora had been inside the claim shanty since the cold hit on January 6th, burning the pig she had slaughtered in December in careful portions, eating spinach she had harvested before the freeze and stored in a cool corner of the shanty, drinking water from a jug kept near the stove so it would not freeze. She went out each midday to check the pits, wearing everything she owned, her wool coat, a wool underlining she had sewn from an old blanket, 3 pairs of stockings, Wilhelm's boots stuffed with more wool. She opened each sash for 30 seconds, read the temperature with her hand, checked the plants, closed it again. The glass was clouded with condensation on the inside. Condensation meant water vapor. Water vapor meant the plants were transpiring. Transpiration means a plant is alive and moving water through its cells. She closed the last sash and went back inside to tend the fire. On January 9th, 1888, with Mellette in crisis and cattle dead in their barns and the worst cellar losses in the county's short memory, Nora Seidel had green food growing 12 inches below the surface of the worst farm in Spink County. Grothaus came on January 10th. He brought his hired man because the road was bad and he did not want to manage a horse alone in that cold. They came in a closed sleigh and tied the horses to the hitching post on the sheltered south wall of the shanty. He knocked and she let him in, and she had coffee on the last real coffee she had, saved since December for this kind of occasion, which she had been expecting since the first week of January. He did not drink the coffee right away. He went to the window and looked toward the south slope, where the glass sashes caught the morning light and glowed faint and warm against the flat grey-white of the frozen January landscape, a mild, incongruous warmth against 31 below. He stood there long enough that his breath fogged the glass. "Those are still running," he said. "Yes," Nora said. He turned from the window and sat down and took the coffee. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He was a practical man, and he looked at her with the particular directness of a practical man who has just watched his own potatoes freeze and his own projections fail. "How much food do you have in those pits?" he said. She told him exactly. 40 pounds of spinach at harvestable stage, more coming in 10 days, 30 heads of cabbage at various stages, 10 of them close to mature. The Siberian kale, which had not stopped producing through any of it kale under glass in January in Dakota. 2 beds of winter radishes ready in 2 weeks. And in the storage channel, 140 pounds of potatoes, 60 pounds of turnips, 20 pounds of dried beans, 41 jars of preserves, none of it frozen. The coffee cup made a small sound against the table when Grothaus set it down. "I have families in Millet without vegetables since October," he said. "The Kessler family has 4 children under 10. The Brunner family, the Paulsen family, the Drexlers," he looked at her. "Ernst Seidel's family, Karl Seidel." He waited to see what she would do with those last 2 names. "I know," she said. She had been expecting those names too. She had in fact been making a list since November of who in the county was most exposed, which farms had shallow cellars, which families had the smallest reserves, because she had known since the first hard cold in December that this winter was going to go somewhere the county was not ready for. The list had Ernst on it. The list had Karl. "I'll sell what I have," she said, "at the going rate in Will's fall catalogue. 2 pounds of spinach for 15 cents, cabbage heads at 10 cents each, turnips at 50 cents for 10 pounds, preserves at 35 cents a jar. Payment in April, when the spring wheat comes in. Not charity. The market rate." "You could charge more," Grothaus said. Outside, the temperature had not moved above 0 in 4 days. Every root cellar in the county at standard depth was frozen solid. "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He drank the coffee. He was calculating. He was always calculating. But the calculation this time was different from October. In October, the arithmetic had been straightforward. Extend her credit, expect to foreclose, recover the money in the form of the property. The arithmetic now was harder to run because the property had not done what property in that position was supposed to do. The slough quarter, which had a predictable failure timeline attached to it in his ledger, was producing winter vegetables in January during a black frost, while every other food store within 12 miles was damaged or destroyed. "You'll need more glass for the February run," he said. "More pipe." "Put it on the note," she said. He extended the note to April 1st, secured against the estimated crop value in the frames, and added the additional materials to her credit. Then he drove back to Millet and told his hired man to let the Kessler family know, and the Brunners and the Paulsens and the Drexlers, that there were vegetables available on the Slough quarter in Section 14, market rate, payment due April. He did not initially send word to Ernst and Karl Seidel. He thought about it and decided it was not his place to send it. He was right. It wasn't. Word reached them anyway, because Millet was 12 families and a grain store and a post office, and things like that travel faster than sleighs on January roads. 3 days after Grothaus's visit, on the morning of January 12th, 1888, the black frost broke, but not gently and not cleanly. First came a false warmth. The Arctic air mass that had locked the northern plains for 6 days collapsed from the west, and in the gap before the next system arrived, a strange warmth swept through. At Huron, 40 miles southwest, the temperature rose to 41 degrees Fahrenheit by 10 in the morning. It was the first time temperatures had been above 0 in nearly a week, and people responded the way people respond when the cold finally breaks. They opened doors and walked outside without heavy coats and let themselves believe it was over. Children left for school in their regular winter coats. Farmers stepped into their fields. The warmth lasted 3 hours. At 1 in the afternoon, a blue-black wall appeared on the northwestern horizon. Within 30 minutes, the temperature had dropped 18 degrees. Within an hour, it was -8 and falling, and the sky had gone white from the ground up with wind-driven snow so dense it cut visibility to 20 feet. The children's blizzard. The storm that killed a minimum of 235 people across Dakota, Nebraska, and Minnesota, most of them children caught outside in the morning warmth who had no warning of what was minutes away. In Clark County, schoolteacher Minnie Freeman led her students to safety by stringing them together with a rope and walking them to a nearby house. In other counties, children froze to death within sight of their schoolhouses, disoriented in the whiteout, wandering in circles on ground they had known all their lives. The youngest victims were 8 years old. Some were found within 100 yards of buildings they never reached. Grothaus locked his store at noon and did not come out for 3 days. On the Slough Quarter, Nora was already inside. She had been watching the northwest since morning, because a barometric drop that fast with a sky that colour does not require instruments to read. She had weighted the glass sashes with sod bricks before 9 o'clock. She had banked additional straw against the windward walls of all 3 pits. She had brought the milk cow inside the shanty at 11, an arrangement that would have been unthinkable in September, but which was now simple arithmetic. A cow generates roughly 700 BTU per hour of body heat. Inside a 280 square foot claim shanty, a cow raises the interior temperature 10 to 15 degrees above what a stove alone maintains. The smell was considerable. She did not particularly care. She opened the shanty door on the morning of January 14th to 6-foot drifts against the north wall, and a temperature of minus 23 degrees, and a washed-out white sky that only looks that particular shade after a major storm has wrung every particle out of the air. She went to the pits. 2 glass panes had cracked in the northwest corners of the outer pits, where wind had forced itself between the sash frame and the sod wall. She patched them with pine tar within the hour. The plants inside were alive. The kale stood upright. The spinach had pressed flat during the worst of the night, but was already lifting in the warmth building inside the glass as the morning sun found the sashes. The heat pipe system had kept the soil temperature above freezing through the entire 31 hours. The storage channel read 35 degrees when she pushed a thermometer down to the floor. She stood in the January silence for a moment. The blizzard had scoured the south rise clean. Rather than burying it, the wind had come from the northwest at such an angle that it stripped the slope and piled the snow against the north wall of the shanty instead. The glass sashes caught the early morning light in 3 clean rows against the surrounding white. From the section road, they would have looked like nothing that belonged in that landscape. 3 rectangles of pale warmth set into a Dakota hillside in January, glowing faintly in a world that was otherwise entirely frozen and still. She started the morning fire in the outside firebox, fed the cow, ate a meal of dried beans and the last of the salt pork, and then went back to the first pit and cut 2 pounds of spinach for the Kessler family. She wrapped it in a clean cloth and set it by the door. She wrote the weight and the date in the ledger. She wrote the Kessler name in the column and the amount and the April due date. Then she picked up her spade and checked the seal on each sash in turn, pressing the glazier's putty back where the cold had pulled it slightly from the wood, making sure the glass was tight. Ernst Seidel's wagon appeared on the section road heading south on January 13th, the second day of the blizzard's aftermath. The road had drifted shut in 3 places, and he had broken his own way through. He stood in the doorway of the shanty in the same coat he had worn to Wilhelm's funeral, and he looked past Nora, at the cow in the corner, and at the south slope visible through the window, where the glass sashes caught the midday sun and held a particular quality of warmth against everything white around them. He did not come inside immediately. "Ernst," Nora said, "my children have not had fresh vegetables since December," he said. "The cellar froze in the first week of January, everything in it." She let him in. She gave him coffee. She told him what she had and what it would cost, and the price she named was identical to what she had told Grothaus for the Kessler family. Not a different price. Not a charity price. The same price. Ernst looked at his hands around the cup for a long time. "Why?" he said. It was not a gracious question. It was not an apology. It was a man who had spent 38 years operating on a particular understanding of how advantage works, and the understanding had produced, in this specific case, an outcome he could not follow the logic of. He had taken her good land, her horses, her husband's wheat, the well Wilhelm had dug. He had left her ground that 3 experienced men had looked at and decided was worth abandoning. The expected outcome of that transaction, the outcome that every piece of frontier experience told him was coming, was that Nora Seidel would fail to sustain herself through a Dakota winter on 80 acres of clay slough with $22 and no horses, and would be gone from the property by spring. "Because your children are hungry," Nora said, "and because I need the April payment to keep the operation running." Both things were true. The first was more true than the second, but the second was the one he could accept without it costing him anything except money, and so she offered it that way. Ernst Seidel bought 2 pounds of spinach, 8 cabbage heads, 20 pounds of turnips from the storage channel, and 6 jars of preserves. He stood in the doorway before leaving and looked at the south slope one more time, the glass sashes in the January light, the faint warmth rising from them that you could see if you looked at the right angle against the cold air. He came back January 22nd for 20 more pounds of turnips and a dozen jars. He came back February 4th with Carl, who stayed in the wagon. Nora wrote each transaction against their names in the ledger, in the same column as the Kesslers, the Brunners, the Paulsons. April due date beside each one. Carl paid April 3rd, through the wagon window, without coming down. Ernst paid April 7th. He came inside. He stood at the kitchen table and put the bills on the wood without looking at her and said, "I underestimated what you built here. It was not an apology. It was a ledger entry, the only kind he had in him." She took it as what it was. "April payment received," she said. "That closes the account." By March 15th, 1888, Nora had sold fresh vegetables and preserved food to 11 families in Spink County. The accounts in her ledger totaled $67.40 in notes payable in April. On April 1st, she walked into Grothaus's grain store and laid $14 on the counter, every cent she owed him in paper money. She walked out to where Bram, the sway-backed chestnut gelding she had bought in February for $12 from a man in Millet who thought he was selling a useless horse, stood tied to the post. She drove back to the Slough quarter. Bram was not a young horse. He was probably 15 years old, swayed through the back, with a left front tendon that thickened in cold weather. He was also the kind of horse that got up in the morning without being asked, and worked all day without complaint, which was what she needed. She named him Bram because he reminded her of her father's old plough horse in Minnesota, who had the same quality of steady persistence about him. That spring she dug the storage channel deeper. Not 4 feet, 8 feet. She spent 3 weeks in April and May taking it down 1 load of clay at a time, widening it as she went from 2 feet across to 4 feet across, extending it from 8 feet long to 16. The clay at depth was bluer and denser than anything she had dug through before, and it came out cold and smelling faintly of deep earth. She piled it behind the channel and smoothed it into a low berm that would hold snowdrift in winter. At 8 feet in Dakota soil, the earth holds at 42 to 44 degrees Fahrenheit in January, regardless of what the air above it does, regardless of snow cover, regardless of sustained -30 temperatures. She had tested this herself. In early spring, she had drilled test holes with the post-hole auger at 1 foot intervals and measured the temperature at each depth with the dairy thermometer borrowed from the Kessler farm. At 2 feet, 31 degrees in late January. At 4 feet, 34. At 6 feet, 39. At 8 feet, 43. Nothing freezes at 43 degrees. Not potatoes, not glass jars, not turnips, not carrots, not dried beans in cotton sacks. Nothing. The heat flowing upward from the Earth's interior geothermal warmth, moving from the hot core core outward through the miles of rock and soil above it, maintains the ground at 8 feet in a temperature that the surface process. Weather cannot touch. The earth at that depth is not connected to the cold above it. It is connected to the heat below, and the heat below has been stable for longer than Dakota Territory has had a name. Nora did not use the word geothermal. She did not need to. She had the thermometer numbers and she had a spade, and she understood exactly what to do with both. She lined the new channel with sod brick on the sides and floor, covered it with 3 boards laid edge to edge from the old shanty flooring, packed 2 feet of straw over the boards, and mounded sod over the straw. Total insulation depth from the channel floor to the outside air. 8 feet of earth plus 2 feet of straw plus sod on top. The January temperature inside it would hold at 42 to 44 degrees no matter what happened above ground. She expanded the forcing pits from 3 to 7 over the summer of 1888, each one built larger and better than the last, each one fitted with the heat pipe system from the first day of installation rather than added later. She improved the pipe design. Instead of running one pipe the length of the pit, she ran 2 shorter pipes from opposite ends, creating a more even heat distribution through the full 12 feet of growing medium. She added a damper to each firebox, a sliding plate of iron she had the Millet blacksmith cut for 30 cents each, so she could control the draft and the burn rate precisely. 2 hours of burning at a controlled low draft in the morning held the soil warm for 22 hours. Less wood, more consistent result, she wrote to Oscar H. Will in Bismarck and described her growing conditions in full. The latitude, the black frost risk, the clay soil, the angles she had settled on, the results she had gotten over 2 winters. Will wrote back with seed recommendations and a personal note saying her sash angle matched what he had arrived at through 7 winters of trial at his Bismarck greenhouse operation. He recommended the Kapusta Russian winter cabbage, a Dakota-bred winter beet, and a new spinach selection he had developed, partly from seed obtained from a Mandan gardener at Fort Berthold Plants, with 400 years of selection for exactly this climate. Hannah Kessler expanded her own small cold frames that spring, using what she had seen on the south slope. She came to Nora in April and asked questions about the pipe installation. Nora showed her. By the winter of 1888-89, the Kessler farm had 4 forcing pits of its own producing through January. Hannah sent her 3 youngest children to carry vegetables to the Bruner family during the hard cold of January 1889. As a gift, the way you pass something along when you have been given something. That was how it moved through the county. Not through a bulletin or a formal system, through women at kitchen tables asking specific questions and walking home with answers they could use. By the winter of 1889-90, Nora had 32 forcing pits on the south slope. She had extended the storage channel to hold 3,000 pounds of root vegetables and 200 jars. She was selling fresh winter vegetables not only to farm families, but to Grothaus directly. He had begun boxing spinach, kale, and winter cabbage for resale to the hotel dining room in Millet and the railroad lunch counter in Huron. Winter vegetables were not a standard commodity on the northern plains in 1890. They arrived by refrigerated freight from eastern markets if they arrived at all, and most families who wanted fresh greens in January simply did without. Grothaus charged the hotel a premium. He paid Nora a rate that let her clear all remaining obligations and begin, for the first time in her adult life, accumulating something beyond what the next season would cost her. In 1891, she filed a Homestead Act claim on an adjacent 160 acres of low-lying slough ground that had sat unclaimed since the 1882 survey, passed over by every grain farmer in the county who looked at it and saw the same things Ernst had seen: clay, drainage problems, standing water, wolf willow. She proved up in 1896. She paid the $10 filing fee with money from her 8th consecutive winter crop. The land dispute over the water drainage easement came in 1892, when Ernst challenged her right to the slough drainage that crossed his section line. He filed at the Spink County Land Commissioner's office in April. The commissioner held the hearing in June. Nora appeared with 5 years of production records, a copy of the Dakota Agricultural College's correspondence praising her methods, and a surveyor's map showing that the drainage easement had been written into the original 1882 survey. Ernst's attorney from Huron argued that the channel she had dug in 1888 constituted an unauthorized modification of the drainage. The commissioner ruled in her favor on both the easement and the channel. Ernst did not appeal. In 1897, the year Grothaus retired and sold his business to a younger man from Huron, he wrote a letter to the Dakota Agricultural College Experiment Station at Brookings before he closed his ledgers for the last time. The station had been publishing agricultural bulletins since 1887, free to any farmer on the mailing list, covering everything from wheat variety trials to drainage construction to building techniques for farm structures. Grothaus described what he called the Seidel forcing pit method. He described it carefully and completely: the pit dimensions, the sash angles, the clay soil modification, the horse manure heating layer, the stovepipe underfloor system, the storage channel construction, the 8-foot depth as the threshold below which nothing freezes regardless of surface conditions. He closed the letter by describing what he had seen in January of 1888, the temperature at -31, the cellars frozen across the county, the 11 families who had needed to eat and had been able to eat because of what one woman had built on ground that everyone had dismissed. He was not a man given to sentiment or to testimony, and the plain description of those 6 days carried more weight for being written by someone who had spent 40 years on the Dakota frontier, calculating rather than feeling. The experiment station replied that they were familiar with Henderson's work and would like the full technical description for their bulletin series. Grothaus told them the permission was Nora's to give. He drove out to the slough quarter and showed her the letter. She wrote to Brookings herself. She described the sash angles in precise terms, 60 degrees from horizontal, the derivation from watching noon shadows shift across 3 winters of adjustments, and noted that she had subsequently checked Henderson's geometry and found herself within 2 degrees of the theoretical optimum for her latitude, which had not surprised her because she had been correcting toward the sun rather than toward a formula. She described the clay modification ratios. She described the pipe dimensions and the damper mechanism and the scrap wood combustion characteristics that left the glass clean in the morning. She described the storage channel in full, including the year she took it from 4 feet to 8, and the thermometer readings that had driven that decision. The bulletin came out in the spring of 1898. It ran 12 pages. Her name appeared in the second paragraph, and again at the end of each major section describing the method's development. Grothaus's letter ran in full in the introduction, unedited. Ernst Seidel left Spink County in 1903 and moved his family to Montana. Before he left, he drove his wagon down the section road to the slough quarter one last time. He stood in the yard and looked at the south slope, where 32 forcing pits caught the October morning light in rows, the glass sashes faintly reflecting the clouds. He did not say much. He shook Nora's hand. He looked at the pits one more time and got in the wagon. She watched him drive north on the section road until the wagon was gone. Then she walked to the slope, checked the October seal on the first row of sashes, and started the morning harvest. The land the Seidel brothers had chosen for her precisely because they believed it could sustain no one had, by 1903, fed 11 families through the worst freeze winter in county memory, paid off a creditor who had expected to foreclose on it, funded a Homestead Act claim on an adjacent 160 acres of identically dismissed ground, and put a method into a state agricultural bulletin that would be read by thousands of farmers across the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Minnesota. It had also fed, among others, the families of the two men who had given it to Nora specifically because they believed it could not feed anyone. None of this required the good land. None of it required the well or the barn or the broken acres or the horses or any of the things Ernst had kept. It required clay and sunlight and old window glass and a south-facing slope that had been sitting there, angled exactly right toward the winter sun, since before anyone arrived to call it worthless. Here is where the physics has always been, and where it sits today. When Nora tilted her glass, sashes at 60 degrees from horizontal arrived at with a nail, a piece of tin, and a plumb bob made of knotted string, refined over 3 winters of watching shadows shift across the back walls, she had landed within 2 degrees of what modern solar engineers call the optimal winter collection angle for her latitude. The formula is local latitude plus 10 to 15 degrees. At 44 degrees north, that calculates to 54 to 59 degrees from horizontal. She was at 60. The difference in solar collection efficiency between 59 degrees and 60 degrees is less than 2%. She had, working alone on a clay rise in October with no instruments and no formula, hit the theoretical maximum within the margin of a rounding error. The greenhouse effect she used is the identical mechanism behind every passive solar building constructed today. Sunlight travels in short wavelengths. Glass transmits shortwave radiation at high efficiency, 90% or better, through a clean pane. Inside the enclosure, the solar energy strikes dark materials and is converted to long-wave infrared radiation, which is heat. Glass is largely opaque to long-wave infrared. The energy entered as light and cannot exit as heat. It is trapped. This is not a property that requires modern glass or modern geometry. It has been a property of glass since glass was first placed over a growing medium, which European market gardeners were doing in the 17th century. Henderson was teaching it in 1867. Nora was using it in 1887. The physics did not change between those years or between 1887 and today. The clay soil she had been given as worthless turned out to be thermally superior to anything a grain farmer would have chosen for this purpose. Dense, wet clay has a volumetric heat capacity of roughly 40 BTU per cubic foot per degree Fahrenheit, nearly double that of sandy loam. In Nora's pits, the clay-growing medium absorbed the day's solar gain and released it through the night in a long, even diminution, holding the root zone above freezing for 12 to 16 hours after the sun went down. The same physical property that made the Slough Quarter impossible for grain farming, dense, moisture-holding, slow to warm in spring, made it nearly ideal for retaining solar heat through January nights. The storage channel at 8 feet did not insulate. It did not need to. At 8 feet in Dakota soil, the geothermal heat flowing upward from the planet's core, moving through miles of bedrock and clay at a rate of roughly 60 milliwatts per square meter at the surface, maintains the ground at a temperature the surface weather cannot reach. Modern soil sensors confirm these numbers every January across the Dakotas. Nora confirmed them with a borrowed thermometer and a post-hole auger in the spring of 1888, measuring at 1-foot intervals, writing the numbers on the same brown paper she had used for the original pit drawings. This is not a set of principles that belong to a particular century or technology level. The forcing pit design came from Henderson's 1867 book. The underfloor heating principle is older than European settlement of the Americas. The Roman hypocaust moved warm air under floors before the 1st century AD. The Korean ondol and the Chinese kang have been warming sleeping surfaces from underfloor heat for 2,000 years. The geothermal temperature gradient that kept her channel from freezing was understood and used by Mandan and Hidatsa builders of earth lodges on the same Dakota River system for 4 centuries before Nora filed her homestead claim. The greenhouse effect has been present in every south-facing glass enclosure since someone first set a window pane over a seedbed. What changes across that span of time is not the physics is fixed. What changes is whether the person standing on a particular piece of ground, in a particular set of circumstances, with a particular set of available materials, has the knowledge to see what is there and the need to act on it. Nora Seidel had the knowledge because she had read Henderson carefully over 2 winters by lamplight. She had the need because Ernst Seidel had left her 80 acres of clay slough and $22.40 and the certainty of a Dakota winter arriving in 6 weeks. The outcome of that combination of knowledge and need, meeting a south-facing slope and a supply of old window glass, is what the Dakota Agricultural College published in 12 pages in 1898, with her name in the second paragraph. In Spink County today, the Slough Quarter of Section 14 is classified in the USDA Soil Survey as Hudek Svea Complex, a clay-heavy soil type rated Class 2 agricultural land, meaning moderate limitations but workable for specific uses. The drainage has been tiled and improved since the 1930s. Wheat grows there in season now, as it grows across most of eastern Dakota. The south-facing rise along the south edge is still there. A slight convexity in the land, 2 feet above the slough floor, tilted toward the winter sun at the angle it has held since the glaciers that shaped the drainage moved through and left it behind. Every October, when the first killing frost comes and the light flattens out and the air takes on that dry clarity that means a Dakota winter is arriving for real, that slope catches the last of the afternoon warmth and holds it maybe 10 minutes longer than everything around it. Nora Seidel knew exactly why. You do not need a textbook to understand that warmth, given the right surface to fall on and the right material beneath it, does not have to go anywhere.